1979, Cheryl and I were married. It was a long time ago. And on Sunday, we got up, had breakfast at McDonald's, went to Sunday school and church, first time as husband and wife. And then on Monday, we got up and we loaded up our truck and we moved from upstate New York to Louisiana so I can continue my education. We traveled down in the 1971 Datsun pickup truck. Yeah, had a hole in the floorboard on the passenger side, so when it would rain, the rain would come off the tire and right in and up Cheryl's leg, but that made her sit a little closer to me. Only problem when I had to find third gear. That was the only problem with that. We didn't have any money or time for a honeymoon, so we kind of enjoyed the trip down. I remember we stopped at Jellystone Park in Natural Bridge, Virginia, and our camping experience was a two-man pup tent. You literally had to back into your sleeping bag. And so we camped one night there at Jellystone, and then we went on down and we stopped at Chattanooga, and we went to Lookout Mountain. And I remember when we got up there, you know, you've got that map right there, and you're trying to see all 7 states, and it wasn't a really clear day. You can obviously see 7 states on a clear day. And so I remember standing there looking out and trying to figure out where all the states were, hoping they would have like a dotted line or something so you could see actually where Alabama was, and you know, but you couldn't. And so I remember that, just that great view, and you can see so many wonderful things when you're up that high. You know, there's a different perspective when you're on the mountaintop. And I think about as we come to our next hero of the faith, we're looking at Moses. You know, before Moses died, the Lord said he couldn't go into the promised land. And so he was on Mount Nebo. And I can imagine Moses standing on that mountain looking down and looking at the places where he had been, where he led the children of Israel out of Egypt. Recounting those stories, the 40 years, and then the years before that when he cared for the sheep and his father-in-law, and then the years before that when he was in Egypt. And he probably just looked back from that mountaintop experience and remembered life. The vantage point of faith provides us a perspective on life that faithless people just don't have. Faith allows us to see things that you cannot see without. Our scripture this morning comes from Hebrews chapter 11 as we look at what the writer of Hebrews says about the faith of Moses. He said, by faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw that he was no ordinary child. And they were not afraid of the king's edict. And by faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as a greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the application of blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. We've been looking at the heroes of the faith and determining what we can glean from their life, their demonstration of living faith. And I think from Moses, there are 4 things we can see from the faith of Moses. We're going to look at 2 this morning, and we're going to look at 2 next week. So it's a 2-parter. Y'all got to come back. You're committed. Otherwise, you will never know what those other 2 are. So here's the first one. Moses' life perspective of faith is the amazing impact of a heritage of faith. Of a heritage of faith. In Hebrews 11:23, it says, by faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. this tells us that Moses' mom and dad, Amram and Jochebed, they had a deep faith in God. They let their faith in God dictate what they would and would not do rather than what Pharaoh had to say. Now, they lived in a very difficult time. It had been 400 years that they had been slaves in Egypt. It's 400 years since Joseph was in charge. And so they're living in a very precarious time. It tells us in Exodus 1:8 that the new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came into power in Egypt. And so it's saying this Pharaoh didn't know who Joseph was. He didn't know who these Hebrew people were. He had no connections and didn't grant them any kind of favors at all. And so they lived in a difficult time. And so not only did he not know Joseph, but it tells us in verses 9 and 10, he said, "Look," he said to his people, "the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies and fight against us and leave the country." When Joseph was there was about 70 Hebrew people he brought with him, his family and extended people. There were 70 people. And they settled in the land of Goshen. Now, 400 years later, there's about 2 million Hebrew people. So the Pharaoh's right in his assessment. He says, man, if these people rise up against us and they join our enemies, what are we going to do? So Pharaoh had a plan. First, he decided if he would treat them cruelly, he would oppress them, he would make them work hard. And so he put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. But the harder they worked, the more God blessed them, the more children he granted to them. And so that didn't work. So then he asked for the Hebrew women, he asked that the midwives would kill the children as they were born. Now, I can't imagine a group more pro-life than a midwife, can you? And so the midwife said, we just can't kill a baby. It's just not in our nature. And so Pharaoh demanded, he said, why aren't you killing these children? And this is what they told him. They said, the Hebrew women are not as Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before we get to them. They said, basically, by the time we get the phone call, we leave the house, we get there, they've already had their baby and they're back to work. And so Pharaoh said, well, that's not going to work then. So then he decided, well, we're just going to kill all the baby boys. And so he dispatched his soldiers. They went house to house killing all the newborn babies, and they would toss them into the Nile River. Can you imagine the crying in the streets, the agony of these mom and dads losing their little one and then being just tossed out as yesterday's trash? And so this is the time, and you think of all the times in history, why would Moses be born now? Why would there be an edict that all little boys being born had to die, and Moses is born now? Because God was choosing to make a point. And so he was born to Amram and Jochebed at this time. And they had to decide if they were going to be people of faith or people of fear. And they chose faith. And so they kept Moses hidden. Scripture tells us they kept him hidden for 3 months. You figure he's getting a little bigger, getting a little more vocal, getting a little more difficult to hide and maintain. And so they said, what are we going to do? How are we going to keep this child hidden? They decided they couldn't do it anymore. And so Jochebed, not knowing what else to do, she took a gamble. No, it wasn't a gamble. She had a hunch. No, it wasn't a hunch. She just went for it and risked everything. No, Jochebed was led by faith to do what God wanted her to do. You see, if Jochebed never did what she did, if she never put her baby boy in a basket and put the basket, filled it with pitch and placed it in the Nile, then the princess of Pharaoh would have never found the basket. If Moses' sister Miriam didn't stay and look through the bulrushes to keep an eye on her little baby brother, then she never would have been there and said, I know someone who can take care of this baby for you, princess. They acted by faith, and God blessed that faith, and the rest is history. You see, God requires our faith so that He can do what He wants to do. So, Pharaoh's daughter found Moses. And Moses was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, but Moses' mom got to raise him. And it tells us in Scripture that Jochebed and Amram got to care for Moses until he was in his mid-child years. I don't know, about 7, 8, maybe 9 years old. And you figure in that time, that's when Jochebed and Amram decided they're going to teach their boy everything about what it means to serve the God of Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac. And so they shared the stories of the Hebrew people. They told them about God and creation and about the faith of Abraham and how Isaac was born. And they went through the stories and they told them time and time again. And so Moses learned from his parents' example of what it meant to worship the one true God. They also taught him about God's love and God's power. And because of all that, what they instilled in him as a little boy, when he grew up, he decided that he was going to follow God rather than follow the Egyptian spies. Every year, 6 million Americans embark on the adventurous journey called parenthood. There are 6 million babies born every year in the United States. And it changes your life, doesn't it? In a wonderful way. And you get these little bundles of joy, and then you say, now what? You know, it's just kind of overwhelming. But how you raise them, how you teach them, how you invest in them will have an impact on the rest of their life. We all watched last Sunday the tragedy that unfolded down in Texas at First Baptist Church Sutherland Springs. And I'll tell you, one of my first thoughts is when I saw the picture of that 26-year-old gunman that went in there. I said, did his parents think this would happen? Were there signs when he was a little boy that this would happen? You know, dishonorably discharged from the Air Force. You know, was there patterns? Was there something they could have done? I don't know. But you know, as you're raising these kids, you say, you know, I want them to grow up to be good adults. I want them to love the Lord. I want them to do their best in society. And so, how do you can't guarantee it, but how do you make sure that you're doing all you can do to help them to become the men and women that they need to be? Well, I think it tells us in Proverbs 22:6. It says, train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he is old, he will not depart from it. Let me tell you what that word train means in the Hebrew. The word train in Hebrew is actually coming from a description of what the midwife would do as soon as a baby was born. They would chew up or grind up dates. And the midwife, as soon as the baby was born, would dip her finger in that date juice. And she'd put it all over the gums and the roof of the baby's mouth in order to get it primed up so the baby would learn to nurse. And the word train up actually means to create a thirst. And so the Proverbs is telling us that we need to create a thirst in our children for the things of God. So you may say, well, how in the world do I create this thirst? And it says, you need to watch in the way he should go. And so what the proverb is saying is that God has given every child, all these 6 million babies born every year, has a certain bent, certain disposition, the way they're going to grow. And we need to make sure that we're looking at the bent that God gave them. And so really what the scripture is saying is if you want to increase the chances that your child will grow up and decide to embrace a faith in God, create in him a thirst to use his unique talents for God and for God's purposes. So how can you discover the bent your child has? Well, let's go to another proverb. 20 verses 11 and 12 say, even a child is known by his actions, by whether his conduct is pure and right. The hearing ear and the seeing eye, God has made both of them. The proverb writer again is telling us that you can see by looking at your child, by studying your child, what their bent is. You need to be the foremost expert on who your child is. You got to learn what they like to do, what they don't like to do, what they kind of run towards, and when you figure out how they're going, then you need to find out what that uniqueness is and make them thirsty for who God is. As parents, we cannot afford the luxury of just feeding, clothing, housing, educating, and letting our kids go and find their own way in religion. As people of faith, we need to make sure we're imparting our faith to the next generation. It's important. And that's what Moses' parents did. They saw, even when Moses was little, they said this was no ordinary child. They said, we've got to do something special because this is a special baby born with a unique bent from God, and we've got to protect him. We can't let him be tossed to his death in the Nile River. They saw the fingerprints of God on their son, and this motivated them to save his life at all costs. And so, what we learn today as parents and as grandparents, if you've got little ones in your life, we need to do all we can to impart our faith into them. The second thing we learn from the faith of Moses is that faith enables us to see sin for what it really is. Let's turn back to our text and look at verses 25 and 26. It says, he chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded the disgrace for the sake of Christ as of a greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to his reward. Moses saw sin for what sin is because he was a person of faith. And he wasn't going to go down that path. How many times it's so foolish to sacrifice the permanent on the altar of the immediate. Now I want that to soak in a little bit, to sacrifice the permanent on the altar of the immediate. We live in an instant society. I want it now. Microwave ovens. Gotta have it now. Credit cards. Gotta have it now. Drive-through. It took 3 minutes. What took so long? Gotta have it now. I could have died of hunger waiting to get my Big Mac. I was raised by people that said, good things come to those who wait. That saying is gone. We've got to have it now. And when we're dealing with things of faith, we're talking about eternity. Is it worthy? Is it worth the risk to sacrifice things of eternal value because of the simple pleasures of I want it now and I want to dabble in sin and forego the eternity? It's not worth it. And so we do not want to sacrifice the permanent on the altar of the immediate. And that's what Moses discovered. Now, when he discovered that, I'm not sure. But he could have decided to be Pharaoh's daughter, or the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He could have decided that's the way to go. Now, you can't blame him. Pharaoh provided him the very best. If he would have stayed in Egypt, things would have been good. And in Exodus 2, verses 11 and 12, it says, one day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were, and watching them at their hard labor, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that, And seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Now, I don't know where that fork in the road was for Moses. When was he thinking, I'm more of an Israelite than I am an Egyptian? How long had that been playing through his mind? How long had he been entertaining, which path will I choose? He knew sooner or later he was going to have to pick a path. Maybe it was in that moment he saw the Egyptian beating that Hebrew servant. But when he did that, he made that choice. And he decided he had to flee. And he gave it all up. Now, we would say, did Moses make the right choice? But it says in the writer of Hebrews that he looked at all the pleasures of Egypt, all the riches, all the treasures, and decided that he was going to go with God. Faith gave Moses the perspective to know the difference between the temporal pleasures, the leasting pleasures, and go with the eternal value of God. It says in Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, since then you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above and not on earthly things. As Christians, we're thinking a lot about the things here, aren't we? We need to get a bigger focus, a bigger picture. Faithless people are in many ways sightless people before they're blind to the eternal joys and pleasures of godly things, and so they eagerly embrace sin's temporary pleasures. I read a story, it's a true story of a Mexican who would go into Arizona and he would go through the junkyards looking for metal that he could take to the scrap yards, and that's how he made money for his family. And so one day he went into Arizona and he found this large metal collection, and so he negotiated the price and he loaded up and he was taking it to the salvage yard so he could get it scrapped. And in those things was an old dental x-ray machine. And as he put it in his truck, that the steel balls, the ball bearings that were in the dental x-ray machine fell out as he was going to the salvage yard, and they rolled around in the bed of his truck. He scrapped all the metal, but those ball bearings are still on the floor bed of his pickup truck. And as he drove back to his village, those ball bearings would roll all over the place and they would roll out. Well, the children found the little metal balls, and they were a big hit. They were doing the marbles things, and man, when you had one of those steel marbles, that was like the best thing ever. And so the kids were going all over looking for those little marbles, the little steel ball bearings that fell out of the back of the truck. And they were the best. If you were one of those kids that had one, then boy, that was awesome. Well, the problem was in some weeks and some months, these kids started to find out that their hair was falling out. They would get a red rash. They were starting to vomit and have fatigue. And about a couple months later, there were several deaths in the village. And they started putting the pieces together that because it was in an x-ray machine, they were radioactive. And they were dying because of those steel balls. That's the way sin is, my friends. It looks really nice. It's really cool. You might even be proud that you've got one. But after a while, there's pain, there's suffering, and there's death. When you look at Moses' choice, I don't think there's any mention in Egyptian history about Moses from an Egyptian perspective. I doubt there's any kind of lasting marker. There's no images of Moses. They forgot about him. But let me tell you this. When the pyramids have crumbled into dust, the faith of Moses will still be there. And that's what faith does for us. I'm going to invite the praise team to come up. And I want to do our invitation just a little bit different this morning. Normally I ask you to stand and sing, and this time I'm going to ask that you sit and listen. Now, I'm not saying you can't sing, you can sing, but here's what I want you to do before you sing. We're looking at making sure that we pass our faith to the next generation. So whatever children or grandchildren or children that are just dear to you, I want you to pray for them during our time of invitation. Pray that your faith will be instilled in their lives. And then the second thing I want you to pray for is, Father, is there any sin in my life that's preventing me from being the child of God that you want me to be? Is there something that I'm hanging on to that's a temporary pleasure that's going to impact my eternal time with you? Because it's not worth it. And so I want you to be able to shed that. And after you pray for those two things, join in the singing. Use the altar. Come forward. Make a declaration. And if you've never given your life to Christ, do it today. Do it today. Guys, lead us in that song.